What's up, everyone, and welcome back to In Search of Answers, the series where you ask me questions and I do my very best to answer them. Got some really fun ones to get into today that I'm very excited about. Quick reminder, if you would like to ask a question to be answered here on the show, you can leave a comment below on YouTube, or if you're on Patreon, head over to Patreon, find the entry for this episode there. And you could either just leave a comment directly on Patreon, or there's a form in there that you can fill out that will get you priority access to have your question answered here on the show. Great. First question for today. Let's just get right into it. This is another one from Shark, who sent in quite a few over on Patreon, who said, not directly related to WoW, but did you find that your experience as a content creator before you worked at Blizzard gave you any respect from fans when you transitioned to your community manager role? Inversely, since you've left Blizzard, have you found that your ability to transition to a full-time content creator was easier than the first time you did it due to the recognition and experience? So first of all, general reminder, questions for this show don't have to be directly related to WoW at all. In fact, we got another one coming up a little bit later on that is more just holistically across the entire gaming industry. This is like Sounds Good Makes Sense is primarily a WoW show that will dip into other topics. This show is just anything. If you have any questions at all, feel free to fire them off. Don't feel like it has to be something about World of Warcraft directly. As far as the question itself, so I'm going to start with after I left Blizzard, and then now more modernly, I'm transitioning into this role as a full-time content creator again. So a couple things that I want to clarify about that. First of all, I didn't leave Blizzard to become a full-time content creator. I left Blizzard to go to TikTok. I worked at TikTok for a year. Then I left TikTok to go to another company called Wonderstorm. And I was there for a while until they basically got hit with all of the nonsense that's been happening to the gaming industry lately, and basically had to lay off a whole bunch of people. And I was caught in that wave of layoffs. So I just wanted to make sure that's clarified, because a bunch of people keep being like, oh, you got fired from Blizzard, which didn't happen. I left. And now you're a content creator because you can't do anything else. No, it's also not true. Literally, I'm getting back into content creation because it's what I want to be doing. And I think I have an ability to make it work. And getting laid off was kind of a good catalyst and a good point for me to be like, yeah, actually, you know what? Let's just go for it. Let's see what happens. So that's why all of that occurred. I definitely feel like getting back into content creation has been easier for me than it was when I first started, for a couple of reasons. One is honestly just obviously, once you have an established brand, it's easier to get that brand to keep moving again than it is to establish all of it from the beginning all over again. It's just the amount of work that I needed to get the ball rolling back in the day was more than it was to just go back to the ball that's already still kind of rolling and keep shoving it, you know? It is worth noting that back when I first became a content creator, it was a very, very different landscape. There was there weren't that many people even doing any of this stuff back in the day. People used to describe me as, he's like Husky, but for World of Warcraft. Husky being a StarCraft content creator, StarCraft 2 content creator that was doing a lot of stuff like that back in the day. I was like, okay, cool. Yeah. This literally the idea is makes gaming videos, but for World of Warcraft. And that was basically it. And even once I started live streaming, there was really only a handful of us. There was me and Towley and a couple of other people that were streaming WoW back in the day. And that was about it. There just weren't that many of us. The issues back then and the difficulties back then with getting started were more from the technical aspect of how to even do this thing. It was definitely not as easy to just launch OBS and put up a stream back then. That literally wasn't an option. OBS didn't exist back then when I was first making content. So things were very different, but it was more from a technical aspect, and also more the monetization for content creation back when I was originally a full-time content creator was almost entirely ad revenue. Whereas nowadays there's multiple different things that you can, Twitch subscriptions became a thing, things like Patreon and so forth. The method by which one can take content creation and make it their full-time job is a lot more robust these days than it was back then. But that said, definitely, I have a lot more experience under my belt. Having spent time working at Blizzard, I understand the relationship between the content creator and the game developer from both directions much more directly now. So I understand a lot more about what a game developer or what a publisher or whoever might be looking for in a content creator to work with than I did back when I had only seen that experience from the content creator perspective. As far as the first part of the question, was being a content creator before I worked at Blizzard, did that give me any respect from fans when I transitioned to the community manager role? That answer is honestly kind of all over the place. There were a lot of people who were like, heck yeah, Laura's going to go be a community manager. And now we've got a guy on the inside. And they were like, yeah, this is great. We got a guy who understands the game is going to be in there and able to get in early on these discussions so that the community's voice is heard more early on and so on and so forth. And that's not to belittle any of the other, like there were a lot of other community managers. That's not to belittle anything that they were doing at all. This is more just like the perception that a lot of fans had at the time when I announced that I was going to work at Blizzard. But there was also just as much the inverse of that. A whole bunch of people being like, oh, wow, what a sellout. Now he's going to go work at Blizzard and just become yet another blue poster and so on. There were a lot of people who, like, I think quite mistakenly got the idea that because I wasn't like going on the forums and raging about like bad decisions that Blizzard made, or I wasn't like making videos talking about how much something sucked that Blizzard was doing anymore. They thought that I wasn't like sharing that feedback with the game developers when the opposite was very much true. I was able to share that feedback much more directly and much earlier by getting an early glimpse of like, okay, here's what we're planning for the next expansion. Then I could be like, okay, this idea right here sounds awful. How are you going to solve these problems? And then like get them thinking about these things well in advance. Now, obviously, there were still things that Blizzard came out with that people didn't like. That I'm not saying that I was obviously I was not able to make the game perfect as a result of being there. That's just not how being a community manager works. But there has been that impression that a lot of people have given, especially more recently, of like, yeah, you were a crap community manager, which no one ever says why that is, other than like, I guess I didn't rage at Ian in the live Q&As. Like those would have existed at all if I had done that. I don't know. I think a lot of it is coming from people who really just don't have any concept of what a community manager actually even does. And even then, like, it's tough to describe what a community manager's role is in a holistic sense, because it tends to be kind of all over the place and every company does it differently. And even inside a community management team, you can have 10 community managers on a team and they will all 10 of them have different jobs and different things that they're doing, because the concept of community management and the concept of community development is so spread out. It's so wide. There's so many different like avenues and ways to approach community management and community development that expecting one because you saw one community manager do this one thing doesn't mean that every community manager does that. That's just one thing that they decided to do. So there's a lot that I could talk about there. It's not really directly answering the question. Maybe we'll get into it at some point. If people have questions about it, turns out I have a show about answering questions. So I'm happy to talk about that stuff, at least as much as I can. Obviously, there are things there are topics that I won't go into specifically about Blizzard, but about my experience while I was there. But yeah, happy to talk about community management in a more a widespread concept if that's something that people are interested in. But as far as this question directly, it was kind of all over the place. There was a lot of people who were like, yeah, I understand how this guy thinks, and so I like that he thinks this way, and he's going to go in and work at Blizzard now. And there are a lot of people who, like, even honestly, even before, they didn't agree with my line of thinking, so they were upset because I became a community manager. Turns out opinions on video games are largely subjective, and I give a lot of my own opinions here, and I don't necessarily expect everyone to agree with them. I'm just saying what I think. So hopefully that answered that question a little bit. It's definitely been easier getting back into content creation these days. And that's not to say that it's easier because, like, I know I was talking a little bit about how hard it was to get started back when I first got started. And a lot of that is different nowadays. There's a lot more, like I said, a lot more robust methods to like monetize as a content creator these days, and lots of different ways that you can boost yourself and so on. But at the same time, there's also a lot more competition as a result. It's much more difficult to make a name for yourself starting from zero these days, because there are 50,000 other people that are all also starting from zero at the same time. And you have to not only figure out how to stand out against them, but also stand out against the ones that have been super established. Like, honestly, if I had not been keeping up with content creation throughout basically the entire time, I was still streaming basically the entire time that I was at Blizzard. I took a break for like 6 months or something like that when I first started. And then I went right back into streaming again. Obviously not as regularly as I was before, but I was still streaming quite regularly for the majority of the time that I worked at Blizzard. And I think if I hadn't done that, I would almost certainly not have been able to get back into content creation nowadays the way that I've been able to, and the way I've been able to settle into it. So yeah, cool. I think hopefully that answered that question. If it didn't, hey, let me know. I'll answer any follow-up questions that I can. But we're going to move on. Next question comes from Terry on YouTube, who says, I understand the appeal of timed content to some players, but feel it really doesn't fit well as a main pillar of progression, and it has contributed to me not playing at the moment. What are your views on where timed content fits well and where it doesn't? So there's a few things to think about in response to this question. The first one is really trying to hone in. Sorry if I just punched the microphone. Really trying to hone in on what are we even defining as timed content here? What are we, when we're talking about quote unquote timed content, what exactly does that mean? Does that just mean things like Plunderstorm or the Mists of Pandaria remix, where it's like, here's an alternate game mode that will be available for a couple of months and then it goes away? Are we talking about timed content in the sense of like cutting edge achievements and things that like, yes, you can only get this during this time period, and then it goes away later on? You're no longer able to get it. Are we talking about timed content in the sense of like an expansion is technically like this, most of the content that exists inside of an expansion is only useful for a period of time. And then when a new expansion comes out, level cap raises, power increases across the board. Now going back and doing those old raids isn't really beneficial anymore. So why would you do it? Is that something you would consider timed content? For purposes of this question, excuse me, I ate too much spaghetti. For purposes of this question, I think I'm inferring that Terry is referring to things like Mists of Pandaria remix, and things like Plunderstorm, where it's a limited, like very much a very clear limited time thing that's only available for a little while and then it goes away. And so probably not, like almost certainly not referring to things like expansions content becoming less useful over time, and probably not referring to things like cutting edge achievements and that sort of concept, like those sort of mid expansion. There is still technically a timer on it, but it's a little bit different in that sense. So for purposes of discussion, I'm going to assume that we're talking about things like Mists of Pandaria remix, things like Plunderstorm, and so on. And as far as where timed content fits well and where it doesn't, I honestly think the timed nature of it is almost like, I almost look at that from the opposite perspective. Here is some content. Does it make sense for this to have a time limit? Here's some stuff to do. Does it make sense? And does it like improve the experience in any way if this is only available for a limited time versus this is something that is always available? You can always go back to it, and it sticks around. And on that note, one big important thing to consider about one big advantage for the development team, which in turn creates an advantage for the players, with having this stuff be timed like this, is it becomes something that Blizzard can put out inside the confines of whatever WoW currently is. They can put it out and say, okay, this is how it exists right now. We're going to have it exist like this for right now. And then we don't have to worry about constantly updating this and keeping this going, keeping this sustained, keeping this as something that sticks around for a long time. We don't need to make sure that it's still fun in a year, because we can put it out right now. We can make sure it's fun inside the confines of what the game currently exists like, and then not have to worry about not overcommit to this existing forever. And that's important for two different reasons based on both Plunderstorm and Mop Remix, but there's different reasons for each. Mop Remix is one that it's important that they don't have to rebalance this. Like they don't need to rebalance this once the War Within comes out. They don't need to go back through and be like, okay, what do all of these class changes and what do hero talents and what does all this other stuff mean for Mop Remix? They don't have to worry about that. They don't have to spend development time on that. They don't have to get a designer to sit down and be like, okay, figure out how to make all of this stuff work again. Figure out how to make all these gems still work. Figure out how all these different, like what gets super broken and so on. They don't have to worry about that because it's going away by then. And then they can do it again later. And I think both for things like Mop Remix and for Plunderstorm, just as I continue sort of stream of consciousness going through this question, I think it's important that these are looked at as things that could potentially come back in the future, right? Like Plunderstorm, I would love to see another round of Plunderstorm happen at some point, maybe on a different map, maybe with some different abilities and so on, but a new round, a new set of rewards for Plunderstorm, have that come back again at some point. Maybe even leave the old rewards and be like, hey, you can earn these again. But having that come back in some capacity when it makes sense for the game again. The thing about Plunderstorm specifically that I think is important for Plunderstorm to be a timed thing is gone from my brain. Where did that go? I had a thought on that I was trying to come back to, and it's It's vanished a little bit. Um, I was really hoping that I would remember it by the time I finished that sentence, and that did not work out that way. So that's unfortunate. But Plunderstorm, I do think it was important for Plunderstorm to be a limited time thing. I remembered. Excellent. Because if that was something that stuck around forever, they would have to find ways to make sure that there were still people playing it. And when something like if that just sort of languishes over time, if they're not constantly adding new things to spice it up, adding new things to make it more interesting, what would eventually happen is there would be like 5 people playing Plunderstorm, and you wouldn't be able to get a match, or you would get a match and you would just win every single time, and like it would turn into a purely PvE thing because you're the only one who's actually playing, and so on. Which is kind of, I know there's probably some people that would have loved that, but that's kind of the opposite of what they were going for in the design and in how they built out Plunderstorm. So the fact that it was a limited time thing meant that they didn't have to worry about like what's the long tail on this, what's the content support plan for Plunderstorm when it's a year on, when it's 2 years on, and so on. They don't have to think about that. It's something that comes out for a little while. People are able to play it for a little while, and then around the time that people are starting to get bored of it, it goes away. So they don't have to worry about now we have lobbies with only 2 people in them. That would be problematic for Plunderstorm. So those are kind of the advantages of having a time limit on stuff like this. The other thing about having timed content for things like Plunderstorm and Mop Remix is that they are then able to specifically fit into gaps of the content release for other content. Now, obviously, I've been talking about how there's a whole lot of WoW going on right now, so that doesn't necessarily, at least when compared to like WoW Classic with Mop Remix, and then also Cata Classic, and also theoretically at some point we'll get Phase 4 of Season of Discovery. All of this happening around the same time, it hasn't really worked out that well in that regard. But Plunderstorm, at the very least, was something that landed at a time where there wasn't much else to do. There was a SOD phase that was ongoing, but we hadn't like just started one or anything like that. It was still just kind of around. And there hadn't really been anything new for Dragonflight in a little while. So that kind of came at a time where it was like, okay, cool, we can fit this into this gap, and this will be something fun for people to do while they don't have anything else going on, really. And then we'll take it away once we're starting to come out with other things, so that they don't feel like they then split between all these different options that are available to them. So those are kind of the advantages of having timed content. I definitely agree that there are points where this is feedback I've seen a lot of places. I hate the concept of FOMO as a thing that games should be trying to create in people, because for me, as soon as FOMO exists, that's the point. That FOMO, by the way, fear of missing out. It's this concept of you should try to create an environment in which your players are playing your game because they're worried if they don't play it right now, they're going to miss out on something. I hate that. I don't think that's not making a fun video game. That's making a video game you feel like you have to play right now, or else you're just not going to get something. You're going to miss out on something. That's not the goal of making a video game. Should be to make a fun video game that people want to play because it's fun, not because they feel like they have to do it right now. So I don't like the concept of FOMO. Obviously FOMO will still occur, right? Like if Plunderstorm comes out, there is going to be FOMO for it because there is a limited time to it. But the question is there a limited time to it because that makes sense for the game mode and because it creates a better overall experience? Or are you putting a limited time on something just to try to make people feel like they have to do it right now? And I think for Plunderstorm and for Mop Remix, my feeling is that they are limited time events because of the advantages that come with being a limited time event for the development team and for the overall like stable of WoW content that's available. I genuinely don't think that Blizzard put these out as limited time events just to try to make FOMO with them. Obviously, FOMO does come as a result of it being a limited time event. It's just a question of what the intention was. Is the point to create FOMO, or was the point this is going to be better for people if it's a limited time event? Yeah, so that's kind of where I land on that whole thing necessarily. I definitely don't like it when games try to be like, hey, we're going to have this limited time event, so you better log in now and play every single day for the next 2 weeks. Otherwise, you're missing out on it, when there's no reason for that to have been a limited time event. Like if there isn't a separate reason why this needs to be a limited time thing, it shouldn't be a limited time thing. Just by the virtue of trying to build FOMO is not a good enough reason for me. But like I said, I feel like both Plunderstorm and Mop Remix there are advantages outside of that that make it make sense for them to be limited time events. I feel like that pretty much covers my thoughts on that topic. But again, if there's anything else you want to hear about on that one, if I missed anything or if I'm just being dumb, go ahead and leave a, this is a weird episode today. Go ahead and leave a comment, ask me any follow-up questions, etc. But I'm going to move on to our last question for today, which comes from Wild Kid Norimac. I'm going to guess is how that's pronounced on YouTube, who said, how do you think the visibility of ELO and ranking has impacted gamers over the years? And this is the sort of question that I absolutely love. I love thinking about this stuff of like, not just from a perspective of how does this thing affect the gameplay? How does this thing affect the way that you interact with the game? But also, how does the way that this has adjusted how you interact with the game affect your approach to a video game as the player? How does it actually affect the way that gamers interact with things? And then when you start thinking about something like, you know, ELO and ranking and so on becoming a more commonly, like more common terms, essentially, more commonly visible things inside gaming over the last several years, how has that affected how gamers approach games at all? And there's a few different things that come to mind for this. First of all, I think the concept of I'm pushing for ranking has become a more accepted thing in gaming over the last like decade, basically. It used to be the case. Honestly, I remember back in the day when there were games that we played, like there was a game called Ravaged, for example, that I like to think about a lot because this was a great case study in my mind of the point where you needed to be unlocking something or progressing something in order for a game to be fun. And this was a game that missed out on that. Like this was a game that was kind of similar in concept to like a Battlefield sort of game. There was like first person shooter, but there was a bunch of things that were going on around the map. There were multiple teams. There was a lot of things you could get into. It was kind of halfway between Call of Duty and Battlefield. And it was a really fun game. I genuinely really enjoyed playing Ravaged way back when it first came out. They did like some weird thing to it eventually where they called it like Ravaged Zombie Apocalypse. And I never played that version, so I don't know what state the game exists in these days, if it even still exists at all. But back in the day, this was a game, it was really fun to play. The problem that Ravaged had was it had no form of meta progression whatsoever. It was a game that you played, you completed a round. Once the round was over, that was it. The round was now done. There wasn't a ranking that went along. There wasn't a like unlock system where you were getting more guns or whatever over time. There wasn't any of that stuff. And this was back in, let's see, Ravage would have been around 2012, 2013. This was right at the point where Call of Duty was really starting to take off. Battlefield was really starting to, like Bad Company 2 had just come out. These were games that were really starting to take off and where these gamers had become accustomed to the concept of after I complete a round, I get something for my time. And that like little extra drip of dopamine, that this was around the time when that became something that was needed for every single video game. If you're playing a game and all you do at the end of the game is you can play it again now, that kind of concept has fallen off over the years. It needs to be like you either you'll complete it once and you'll say, all right, I'm done. There's no reason for me to play this again. Or if it's a PvP game, especially, you're going to assume that there's some sort of progression that occurs, whether that is by your ranking increasing, whether that is by your, you get some unlocks or something, you get XP toward leveling up your battle pass or anything like that. These are all things that players now expect in 2024 as like, that's just part of the game. Like that's just literally part of game design is what is that little drip feed of dopamine that you're giving to people that is telling them, congratulations, you completed a thing and here is your reward. What is the reward that they are getting for their time investment? So thinking specifically about ELO and ranking, I use the Ravaged example because that to me just is one that sticks out in my mind of sort of the turning point for this. And that was one where there wasn't a meta progression. The concept of not having an ELO or a ranking or some sort of number, like we even saw this in Plunderstorm more recently. There were a bunch of people who wanted to be able to track how many kills they had gotten. They wanted to be able to track like how many first place wins they'd gotten and so on. They wanted to see that because they wanted a number that was increasing that felt like they were accomplishing something and felt like the PvP side of the game was something that had a little bit more robustness to it other than just unlocking these renown rewards, essentially. So it's definitely impacted what gamers expect out of a game over the years. Elo and ranking in particular are things that, like, we've all heard the phrase Elo hell, right? Like, that was something that got popularized with League of Legends back in the day. The concept of my ranking is at a point where I can't win games because all of my teammates are garbage, and I can't get out of this Elo hell where all of my teammates are garbage because I can't win games because all of my teammates are garbage, and like this whole concept of a vicious cycle. Whether or not that was actually the case has been debated many, many times over the years, and like, I still don't think we actually know for sure or not if that was ever actually a thing, because conceivably, if all of your teammates are garbage and that's why you're losing, then the same thing is happening to the other team. And they can't both always, you can't have games of League of Legends where both teams lose. Like, that doesn't work out. So presumably, if you are stuck in Elo hell and you are matched against a team who is also stuck in Elo hell, one of you's going to win the match. There isn't an end in which, like, League of Legends doesn't I don't even know if it can end in a tie. It certainly very rarely actually does, if it can. So the concept of Elo hell and so on was this thing that was honestly kind of a myth in a lot of senses, kind of a boogeyman, but it was something that very much affected the way that gamers approached League of Legends, especially if they felt like they were stuck in Elo hell, because it led to a lot of really, really toxic behavior, people just AFKing, people leaving constantly, people voting to surrender 5 minutes in because their top laner died early or whatever. Like, it leads to a lot of really, really bad and toxic behaviors if your game is set up in a way where people then start to make the interpretations. There's lots of different ways that other companies and other games have tried to have a ranking that is kind of obfuscated enough. Obfuscated means just basically make it confusing, make it hard to tell exactly what's going on. I'm never a big fan of game design with obfuscation or just making something hard to understand as like a core element, because someone out there is going to figure it out, whether or not it's easy for the average player to whether or not you've put it in a way that the average player understands it relatively easily or not. Someone out there is going to figure out how it works, or at the very least, they're going to make a strong enough theory about how it works that they then follow that, and that then impacts the way that they play the game. So I'm never a big fan of trying to hide things from players in terms of how a system actually works. There are some exceptions to that. There are some cases where you kind of need to hide from players, but that usually comes down to like figuring out how to like stop hack bots and stuff like that. Like, how do you stop an aimbot? Well, don't tell players how you're stopping the aimbot, because if you tell them that, they make an aimbot that doesn't work that way. It's basically what it boils down to in those sorts of regards. But when it comes to like straight up game mechanics, I'm not a big fan of trying to hide the rank from the player. There have been some methods that people have done that I don't mind as much. Like, for example, StarCraft 2 had the ranking system where, at least at first, when the game first came out, it was like you had bronze, and then you had silver, and then you had gold, and then you got up to platinum. And it wasn't until you got to platinum that you were actually on a ranking that was like just these players and you're ranked against each other. Most of the time it was like, okay, you're gold, but you're in a gold league, and there are who knows how many gold leagues, but we're just listing where you're at in your gold league. And that was kind of how that worked. And I don't hate stuff like that. I think that's perfectly fine. It gives a progression for a player who is at a lower end of the ladder, essentially, that feels like they can get a little bit better over time and feels like they have something to strive for. But it's not like you're not looking and seeing like, okay, I'm down here and Faker's up here, and you're not making that direct comparison all of the time. That sort of stuff I think is fine. It does end up like inevitably someone at some point is like, oh, well, you're gold and you're in this league, and so therefore these are the people you're up against, and you try to like figure that out, like reverse engineer the system a little bit, but that becomes something that you don't necessarily need to go and look up to figure out where you are. And I do think in terms of ranking for games like StarCraft 2, which again, it didn't really have any meta progression whatsoever, the ranking progression was kind of the only reason to play SC2 online, like as far as outside of just for fun, right? The ranking system was the only progression mechanic for it. And again, gamers really feel like they need some sort of progression mechanic these days. Otherwise, once they've completed a game, they just kind of don't want to play it again. Especially for a PvP game, you don't want that. You want them to do a round, and then you want them to do another round, and then you want them to do another round. The gamers want that to be a thing too, where they have a reason to play more than one round. So it's definitely been interesting. It is interesting to see a lot more games starting to try and back away from that nowadays as well. Or doing more things like like the recent trend of extraction shooters, for example, where you have a round and what happens in that round kind of is just what happens in that round, but you might be able to take some items out of that round and then put them in your stash and then have them for later, but like you could still lose them if you brought them into the game. So that nothing is permanent in that sense, but you have the ability to gain some stuff and sort of turn each round into maybe things come out a little bit better, maybe things come out a little bit worse. That sort of stuff has been interesting to see start to come out as a trend. But again, trying to get back to the question specifically about ELO and ranking, I think it's the sort of thing where there's definitely a lot of players who get way, way too hung up on ranking to the point where one of two things happens. Either you get really toxic about losing or you get very scared of losing. I know there's a lot of games that people would be like, I would totally play this if there was an unranked mode. I don't want to play it in ranked mode. I was the same way with Overwatch, to be honest. Like, I would play a whole lot of Overwatch. I never touched the rank modes in Overwatch 1, and I still haven't touched it in Overwatch 2 either. Because I don't have any interest in ranking myself against other people who are playing Overwatch. When I play Overwatch, I want to just be able to hop in, have some fun, derp around for a little bit, and I'm okay with the fact that I didn't earn anything for my time spent in Overwatch. Except maybe some like battle pass progression or whatever nowadays. Or back then, like maybe I would get a back in Overwatch 1, maybe I would get a loot box. It's weird to me that the Overwatch 2 battle pass, at the very least in my experience, the Overwatch 2 battle pass makes me miss loot boxes. It's pretty rough. But anyway, hopefully that answered that question. It's definitely, there's a lot of ways to dig into that, and it's a very big question as well. There's lots of different thoughts to have about all of that. I'm curious what all of your thoughts are as well. If you want to leave a comment, even if you're not asking a question, I'd still love to hear what your thoughts are on this or any of the topics that I talk about here on the show. I see this, like, even though it's me like talking to a camera and then uploading the thing, it's still a discussion, right? It's still something that I can put out my thoughts, and I genuinely enjoy seeing and appreciate seeing people's like reactions or disagreements, or if you just feel like what I'm saying is stupid, like, tell me what I'm saying is stupid. Like, I'm fine with that. I've been on the internet for a while. I'll be okay, I promise. But we are going to wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Again, if you would like to ask a question, you can just leave a comment below. Or if you're a patron, head over to Patreon and either leave a comment on this episode over on Patreon, or there's a form. There will be a link to a form that you can fill out to ask your question in there. But that's it for me. Thanks again, everybody. I'll see you next time.